So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, we're going to continue right now with the tafsir that we started a couple of years ago, but right now, inshallah, we're going to be able to continue this. So, the ayah that we're still on for the past 5 weeks is really this ayah number 43 from, of course, Surah Nisa. So, we did actually go in lots of details in terms of what la taqrabu, and we went into details about this ayah in particular, and we only had passed, let me see, up until أو على سفر. So today, inshallah, we're going to continue these portions of it. So we said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, do not approach, or at least do not engage, to be more specific, because la taqrabu does not mean we actually considered that the preponderant was not saying do not approach, but it was more do not engage in salah, that is when a person is intoxicated. And we talked and went into details about intoxication and the rules of intoxication, or at least the rules that relate to it in terms of what if a person were to be drunk, what does and how what the implications it has on their marriage, on their divorce, on the different actions entering the masjid, and whether that is impure or not impure, and the list goes on and on. And we talked about وَلَا جُنُبًا إِلَّا عَابِرِي سَبِيلٍ, if a person was in a state of janaba, and we said that the state of janaba simply means the person had actually engaged in or reached at least the sexual climax in different ways, whether that was intimacy or whether that was masturbation or even whether that was through a wet dream. And we talked about the details. At the end of the day, the person is supposed to be taking a shower, and we mentioned in detail whether the person is permitted to enter the masjid or not in that state of janaba, that is before taking a shower. And we went in details about if the person was ill, or even on a journey, or coming from the place called the Gha'at, which is a low area. We're going to get in details about right this little point right here, فَتَيَمَّمُوا. So we're going to jump just a little bit about tayammum because of its importance, inshallah, and then we're going to get back to each and every single one of these. I know it's really ironic. Why would you jump all the way here to get to there? Well, we're going to see, inshallah, we're going to cover a couple things just because the context in Arabic is totally different if we were to actually explain it in English. Because if you look at these wordings, so if you were in an illness, if you were on a journey, or if you come from that low area, which was kind of like a public bathroom, but it was in a low area, and of course we'll go into details about that. Or if you touch women and you cannot find water, then engage in the alternative of dry ablution. We'll talk about that piece of it. What is that dry ablution, and what does it mean to do tayammum? So it's really important to talk about that, because although alhamdulillah, water is not a scarce thing during our times, but again, this was basically something that they didn't have the resources for, and two, which is water. And it can happen where you can actually have a scarcity of water. So the alternative, inshallah, we're going to be covering it. Now, one thing is that we did also talk about what it means to be ill, and how far and what is the amount that is permitted. And we simply made the story short, and we said it's basically if a person fears that using water would, one, increase their illness, in other words, get their illness even more advanced if water usage was not something that was safe for them to use. So whether that was going to enhance their illness, or whether that water usage was going to get the illness at least prolonged. So it's going to make it prolonged in where probably maybe that water usage was one mentioned by the experts that water usage prolongs the illness, or whether the person themselves had actually recognized that water usage was actually affecting them negatively. So if the person recognizes or realizes that every time I would take, let's say, 2 showers a day or 3 showers a day, that's making me itch, it's becoming too irritating, or if, for example, they're seeing that their body is starting to start getting flares or so forth, and that it's harming them, or probably that they would get fevers or get somehow uh, let's say a longer time for them to heal. In that situation, it would actually be permissible for them to not use the water and use Taymmum instead. If using the water, if we're talking about taking a shower, for example, and they're capable of making wudu, then they should do wudu. But if making wudu is also something that probably prolongs their illness or probably gets them somehow basically gets them even worse with their illness, then in that situation, they can do tayammum as an alternative. So just to clarify that. So, and we did mention that scholars actually had differences of opinions on whether, number one, on whether we're talking about whether we're talking about a person is on a journey or whether they can be residents as well. We did mention the differences of opinions between scholars. We didn't go in details, but I think, inshallah, it's important to just keep in mind. So the question that usually people ask when we have differences of opinions between scholars, who should I listen to? Number one, you don't have to follow a specific madhab because the madhab themselves didn't actually happen and were a later development after the Prophet ﷺ. So Abu Hanifa actually died 150-year hijrah. Mind you, the Prophet ﷺ died 11-year hijrah. So we're talking about 100 and what is that, 49 years? Is it, did I calculate right? 39? Yeah. When you're talking about Imam Malik, he died 179 years, 79-year hijrah. When you're talking about Shafi'i, he died 205. You're talking about Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he died 264 hijriya. And of course, those weren't the only madhab. There was madhab al-Tabari, there was madhab al-Thawri, and Layth ibn Sa'd. There were so many different madhab. It wasn't really exclusive to the four schools. But the four schools, those were the four schools that I guess had the best students to document the madhab. And later, those madhab or those schools were later the ones to be at least documented. And let's say the school was established in terms of having at least the resources, and of course, the different resources were founded, and it was easy to keep track of the different evidences, easy to keep track of the different development, let's call it development, and the different times of development from one era to another within that madhab. Now, when we talk about, well, which madhab to follow, you don't have to follow a specific madhab, but it would be important to follow and learn a madhab just so that you're not cherry picking. And of course, you're not fatwa shopping and making sure that you're learning it, especially if you're a student of ilm. It would actually be helpful to use a specific madhab or at least a specific school. So if you're going to, let's say, a school to learn, let's say your nearest school is teaching madhab Shafi'i, by all means, start and learn madhab Shafi'i. That's all right. Do I have to take the madhab Shafi'i, for example, in transactions? And also, there is no have to, because remember, the whole idea about madhab actually happened after the Prophet ﷺ, and you cannot say have to and obligate something that Islam itself did not obligate. There is no obligation to follow a specific madhab because those madhab, they actually came after the Prophet ﷺ. So even the Prophet ﷺ was basically, before them. Therefore, those madhahib, what they were really trying to get to was what was the most accurate, at least fatwa, or the most accurate interpretation to get to the Prophet ﷺ. They were trying to trace what would be the most preponderant to be that was the Prophet ﷺ's practice or teachings. So therefore, to say it's obligatory to follow a specific madhab is actually not accurate. And most of the times, you would say that people would call and say, I want this answer to be based on this or that madhab. I would say that most of the times, these people are really simple in their Islamic education to understand even the chronology of how these madhab developed, because they cannot say it's obligatory. So what should I follow? If you trust a scholar's knowledge, you trust their taqwa, you trust their research, then their madhab or whatever answer in research they had done is going to be the madhab, or at least let's call it the answer that you would want to embrace. Do I have to know the evidence and do I have to search all the evidences and all of that? You don't have to, because remember, to say do I have to actually means that we're here saying you're obligated to do so. And you're not necessarily obligated to know the details of the evidence and to know the research and to know the differences of opinions and to know the debate and all of that. That's another level. So you've got a couple levels. The first level is the level of a scholar. A scholar's level is the level where they have to know the evidence and they have to do their research and they have to see the differences of opinions and they have to see which hadith is authentic and which one is not and which one is stronger and etc. And if it comes to them, even if, let's say, this person was Shafi'i madhab in most of his education, but later on, after research, they discovered that in one particular issue, the madhab, at least in that particular fatwa or that particular issue, let's say Taymmum, let's say wudu, they recognized and they noticed that the preponderant opinion, based on what their research had led them to, is that it was actually the Malikis that had a stronger opinion in that particular fatwa. Then in that situation, to be phonetic and take the madhab Shafi'i regardless is actually not right. Is actually, let's call it, against even the practice of their sheikh. Because if you look at even the Shafi'i, the Hanafi, the Maliki, all the different scholars, they all had agreed on one quote, on one phrase. إذا صح الحديث فهو مذهبي. If that hadith was proven to be inauthentic, then that is what I'm going to be embracing in terms of accuracy, in terms of preponderance, and certainly in terms terms of what I will follow. That was the main teaching. That was the main goal, was really to get to what is the Prophet ﷺ, the teaching. What did he want us to practice? And therefore, that takes us to the first level. The second level is basically the level that the second level is basically the talib al-ilm, the student of knowledge. The student of knowledge, if they're capable to research, well, good for them. But if they're not capable of researching, but they're capable of at least learning certain details, well, that's actually good. That's very important to get into talib al-ilm, where they're learning the evidence, they're learning how to go back to the hadith, to the ayah, to understand what Islam really says by going back to the evidence. That's stage two, talib al-ilm. Talib al-ilm, why is that important? Because with talib al-ilm, remember, إنما أدعو الله على بصيرة. When you want to do da'wah, when you want to teach, when you want to grow in your Islam, طلب العلم and seeking ilm is a way to help you grow in the light in your heart and certainly grow in the light in your mind. Because remember, the different stages of Islam, in where you have the stage, oh no, the stage, the different stages in Islam is basically the stage in where one, you're enlightening your mind. That's the stage of Islam. Two, you're enlightening your heart. That's the stage of Iman. And three, you're enlightening your spirit, and that's the stage of Ihsan. With that enlightenment, you're actually gaining a different vision. In order to grow in your vision, there's no way to grow in your vision if you don't broaden your perspective, you don't broaden your understanding. Because by broadening your understanding, that's what's going to help you broaden your connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with the evidences, with Islam, and why different things are crucial in your life as a Muslim. And that's why talab al-ilm is actually the key to even growing and becoming a better Muslim. So that's talab al-ilm. I think what would be important to say right now is that one sad thing in our society is that we're actually seeing, especially, I guess, in the West right now, where I think we're going into something very similar to what the West had gone into at one stage in their time, in where it was the let's call it the awam, or at least just the general population, taking that initiative, if you would want to say, taking the role, taking the leadership in interpreting Islam, and that is really problematic. Because if we're taking the ghawaiya, or the mobs, or just the general population interpret the religion, this is actually اتبع الناس رؤوسا جهالا. The Prophet ﷺ had pre-warned about this situation that we'll be living in, which is the times today, in where people, the Prophet ﷺ, would follow رؤوسا جهالا. They would follow leaders that are really nothing but ignorant. They would be giving certainly very probably, let's call it inspirational wordings, inspirational interpretations, or sometimes nothing but eloquence that contains nothing but a narrative and is nothing but emotional speech. And of course, the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّ مِنَ الْبَيَانِ لَسِحْرًا. Certainly, from eloquence, it may contain some magic, it may give you a flowery feeling, but the only way to distinguish between what is actually, let's call it, based on Islam, and between what is really nothing but, let's call it, affecting your emotions, in which is what today is really seen motivational speeches. Motivational speeches, they are right now considered those that are dua and considered those that are in the lead. That's actually problematic, and that's why the Quran and Islam were always telling you that the first thing is اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق. You have to read in the name of the Lord Almighty. You have to put in that ilm. You have to put in the effort to seek ilm, to make sure that you are not just following motivational speeches, but you're actually engaging in finding the true light that leads you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's talab al-ilm. Number 3 level. Number 3 level is a talib ilm, but a less degree talib ilm. So they know in general, they are not putting in the same effort of an advanced talib ilm, but they are trying. And with these students, let's call them the second stage of talib ilm, in that situation, they can take their shuyukh as, well, my shaykh gives this fatwa, and I will embrace their fatwa and take that fatwa as the fatwa that I'll depend on. The last one is basically the general awam. What is al-ammi? Al-ammi is basically the person that is not a student of ilm, and certainly the person that is not a scholar. So that ammi, or the general Muslim population, their madhab is really the madhab of the scholar that gives them the answer. Does the ammi have to know? Do they have to know the evidences for each and every single ruling? The answer is no. They don't have to know the details. They don't have to know the evidence. They don't have to research. I just want to know, is it fits halal or haram? And that's it. That's all they want. They could just say, well, one thing that they have to research, though, they can't just blindly follow everything. They have to research to know that that particular scholar is doing his homework and research, is actually specialized in. Number 3, they're expecting that they have the taqwa to actually give them the answer, not to gain publicity, but to find and help that person reach guidance. Now, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud had said, "اغدو عالما أو متعلما ولا تكن الثالثة فتهلك." اغدو, in other words, become a scholar or become a student of ilm, but beware of becoming the third and finding yourself in complete chaos or in complete destruction. So the last category of just the mobs is actually, at least in the least to say, is really on the brink of getting into a number of different shubuhat and shahawat, in different misconceptions, shubuhat and shahawat, and they're going to probably find themselves probably in the nets of different whims, in the nets of different confusions, in the whims of, or at least in the slippery slopes, in getting into finding themselves in different places of fitan. Now, so number 1, do you have to know the evidence? That's a talib ilm. Number 2, in where do I have to follow a certain madhab? Which madhab is best to follow? The best madhab. So this is not me, but most scholars, and at least modern scholars, do recommend for talib al-ilm to start with the Shafi'i madhab. Now, this is not because I'm living in Malaysia and predominantly Shafi'i area, but this is because you had a number of different scholars actually say starting with the Shafi'i madhab is probably a good idea because it has a lot of hadith resources that it stretches about and helps you learn at least on a good basis. Yet, if you are learning on another madhab, or at least if, let's say, you had access to a school that's teaching Maliki, great, start with that. You had a great and a good access that's teaching Hanafi, start with that. That's absolutely fine. You don't have to start with the Shafi'i madhab or any other madhab. At least start with talab al-ilm. So let's do with that. And where were we as well? So the other piece of it is that if a person, let's go back to the ayah right there. So when you see the differences of opinions, إِوَإِن كُنتُم مَرْضَى, and it was telling me if you are ill, and of course we went into the different levels of what it means to be ill. Is it the starting of an illness? Is it if water would enhance the illness? And three, and whether if it or it even prolongs the illness. So all of these different areas in where if water was actually affecting the wound or at least the body in such a way, then in that situation they can, one, probably if they needed to take a shower, they could take tayammum as an alternative. But if, let's say, we're talking about minor impurity that requires wudu, but even with wudu, that was prolonging their illness, or that was at least exacerbating more of their illness, in that situation, they can use tayammum as an alternative. The other piece is that, yes, scholars had differences of opinions on the let's call it the resource, whether it's a doctor or whether it's your own experience. But it's important to mention that some scholars, they actually regarded that if a person is ill, yes, they can do tayammum, but some scholars regarded that only if they're on a journey. All right, except, let's say, look at this point of a Shafi'i, except if the person feared that they would actually get into some fatal situation. So in that situation, they basically said, well, it's a fatal situation. We know that if the person were to use water, they would actually die. So in that situation, they said, well, then in such a circumstance, we know for sure, and this is not based on doubt. But that's not what necessarily all scholars would agree on, because they considered if the person feared, so they thought, and they had a good amount of, let's call it preponderance, that indeed, if you were to use water, that was going to prolong your illness, or that was going to get your health deteriorated in that situation, that you can use tayammum as an alternative to using water in situations where water, one, whether water was accessible, or two, whether water was not accessible. If using water was harmful, which is actually called hukman. In other words, we would know based on judgment, even though, yes, we've got water and definitely plenty of water, but we know that using water was going to make the person's health deteriorate, or whether we've got water, or whether it was going to prolong the illness. In that situation, the person can do tayammum instead. Right, let's move on. So how do we actually do tayammum? So I'm going to actually share a different screen to help you. And you know what? I'll make the story short. So when we're speaking about tayammum, the different ways to do tayammum, you had the first way was the madhab Shafi'i and Hanafi, and they basically said it's two strikes. What do we do tayammum on? You can do tayammum on, one, soil, two, sand, three, rocks. Differences of opinions on rocks, especially. Why? Because the ayah says, let's look at that ayah, and oh, here we go. Look at that ayah, and the ayah actually says, oops, what did I do? Sorry about that, everyone. Let's go again. All right, here we go. Let's do it again. So because the ayah says sa'idan tayyiba, so the word sa'id actually means what is above earth. Tayyiba actually means pure. So we're talking about pure earthly substance that you can use as tayammum. So for the madhab Shafi'i, they actually said that you can actually use rocks, soil, and sand as an alternative to, of course, water, and therefore doing tayammum. Now, it's important to mention, let's see, this sister is asking, what about a person that has OCD, takes them 15 to 13 minutes to make wudu? Can they do tayammum? So no, the person that has OCD, it's not that they can do tayammum, so certainly they cannot do tayammum because of the OCD. But what they can do is that we would basically tell them, listen, the cure for OCD in Islam is that you're going to assume that you are right and you cannot do it again. If you were standing right there and you did, and you start going into this paranoia, did I do the right hand? Did I do the left hand? Did I already do the feet? What did I do? We're going to say, you are fine. You did everything. Move on. Can I do it a second time? No, it's a bid'ah to do it a second time and a third time. And this is the treatment for OCD in Islam. You're going to assume that you are right. You're going to assume that everything was done right. So therefore, do not do it again. And it would be a bid'ah to do it again. Because a person with OCD and that paranoia, they're always doubting one piece of practice. Did I do it? Maybe not. What happened? Did I forget? And then they become extremely paranoid on whether was it right? Maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to hold me accountable. And what if I did this? What if I didn't? And it becomes a very strong paranoia if we were to let the person do it again and again and again, because it's going to grow. The paranoia is going to grow in them if we were to say, do it again. Even if you give them tayammum, they're going to do tayammum 30 and 40 and 50 times and still doubt whether the tayammum was done right or not. So giving them tayammum is not the solution, because they will still be paranoid whether the tayammum was done right or not. So that's why tayammum is not an alternative for a person with OCD, unless they didn't have water, or unless they didn't have an illness or a reason where that prevented them from using water. All right, I hope I answered that one. Okay, so let's go for, well, how do we actually do the tayammum itself? So for madhab Shafi'i and Hanafi, you basically strike, let's just say, what about the amount of soil? It doesn't have to be a large amount. A tablespoon, put it on a piece of paper, put it on that, and basically do it and strike it on it, and you are fine. All right, so for madhab Shafi'i and Hanafi, you're going to strike one strike on the soil, and that the first strike is going to wipe your face with it. The second strike is going to have the right palm wipe over the left hand up to the wrist. The second palm, the left palm is going to wipe over the right hand. So basically the opposite of one another. The first strike is going to wipe the face. The second strike, you're going to light the right palm wipe over the left hand up to the wrist, the left palm, wipe over the right hand, and so forth. Now, they had differences of opinions on whether it's going to be up to the wrist, or whether it's supposed to be up to the elbow, or whether it's even supposed to be up to, I guess, the shoulders. Just to clarify those differences of opinions, the preponderant is that it's up to the wrist and not necessarily up to the elbow. That's the sunnah. What is the evidence? So the evidence, let's look at, I'm going to put it out for you so you could actually see it. Let's see this right there. Okay, wanted to show you for Maliki and Hanbali, they basically said, well, it's just one strike. So here, Hanafi and Shafi'i, they said 2 strikes. Madhab Hanbali and Maliki, they said 1 strike. And they actually considered that it's up to the elbow, okay? Up to the elbow. But for the Madhab Shafi'i and Hanafi, basically said the palm or the wrist that is just up to the wrist. Let's see where the hadith is and what hadith is that. So Imam al-Bukhari, he basically, I want you to look at this one right there. Imam al-Bukhari, he basically had laid out his chapters based on his madhab, or at least his fiqh, because he doesn't have necessarily his own madhab. He's a scholar of hadith, not a scholar of fiqh, but still, he basically had labeled his chapters based on these fatawas that he regarded as preponderant. And that's why they would say fiqh al-Bukhari fi tarajimah. The fiqh, the knowledge, the preponderant opinion in regards to legislature for al-Bukhari is noted in basically the titles of each and every single chapter in the books of hadith that he had actually had laid out, which is Sahih al-Bukhari. All right, so he said, Babu Taymmum lil-wajhi wal-kaffayn. He said the chapter that tayammum is for the face and the hands. The hand is really up to the wrist. And then he basically had narrated a hadith and mentioned the hadith in where Ammar, he told Umar, he said, I basically tama'akt. Tama'akt actually means when, well, here's what happened. They were on, him and another Sahabi, Ammar, was on a journey. And then, of course, he knows about Taymmum, but he thought Taymmum was an alternative for wudu. But he went into a wet drain, got into a wet drain, and, well, he didn't go into it, but when he got a wet dream, okay, and he thought, well, if wudu, minor impurity, basically is tayammum to be done as an alternative when there's no water, then therefore a major impurity, which basically would require ghusl. So what he did was he basically did his own analogy and thought, well, if I'm supposed to be washing all my body in case of a wet dream, then in that situation, the analogy would be he basically went into the sand and literally dived into the sand, dived into, I guess, the soil, and all his body literally dived in. All right, so that's what tama'aktu. فأتيت النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال, the Prophet ﷺ, when he came to the Prophet ﷺ and he said, hey, I basically dived into that soil. The Prophet ﷺ said, يكفيك الوجه والكفين. The Prophet ﷺ responded and he said, it was enough for you to just wipe on your face and your, here, the word il-kaf. The word il-kaf means palm, so not arm. The word palm, in where that is the sunnah up to there. What about the hands? Can we actually go farther? Let's see what Ibn Hajar says. Why are we quoting Ibn Hajar? Because when you look at Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar, Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar, he basically came to Sahih al-Bukhari and he did a very important explanation for Sahih al-Bukhari. It's called Fath al-Bari, Sharh Sahih al-Bukhari. Now, Fath al-Bari, it depends on which printing you're looking at, but Fath al-Bari is in almost 20 volumes, well, it depends on which printing you're talking about. Quote Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani is from Asqalan. Where's Asqalan? It is right 20 kilometers away from Gaza. Away from Gaza. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give them victory. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give them not the victory, but also the mercy and shed his mercy on them and give them all, Ya Rabbi, the support that is needed. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for those that are in need of food, give them food. And for those that have lost a loved one, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give them the power of patience. They surely are the people right now going through the worst of what I would consider probably the conspiracy ever to happen on any Muslim group, of course, because number one, you could see the West, the East, even the Arab countries and even the Muslim countries are right now collaborating with the Zionists. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give them all the defeat, Ya Rabbi. The Zionists give them all the defeat, Ya Rabbi. Allahumma ameen, Allahumma ameen. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala end Israel, even if this video gets deleted. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bring an end to Israel, Ya Rabbi. Allahumma ameen. Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, he said, to explain this one, he said, in other words, al-wajib al-mujzi'. He said, in other words, what he was saying is that this quote, what the limit is really the wiping of the face and also the palms. And he said that's why that is al-Bukhari. He actually said بصيغة الجزم. It was to give an affirmation that this is the limit to just wiping the face and the palms, in where it was more of an affirmative wording. And even though there are so many differences of opinions in that regards, because of course we would have other ahadith, and he said, as for the ahadith, the different hadith in regards to the tayammum, he said there's no other hadith except hadith Abi Juhaym and Ammar. Those are the authentic hadith in regards to the limit and how tayammum is done. So hadith the Abi Juhaym or Abu Juhaym, it basically did mention al-mirfaq. Now al-mirfaq would actually include not all the way up to the elbow, or at least according to some scholars, the mirfaq would actually be, because the ayah actually says al-mirfaq to mean the elbow, and some would say al-mirfaq would be in between the elbow and also basically the wrist at the end of the day, in where you could say that there are two authentic hadith. One, Abu Juhaym's hadith was actually mentioning al-mirfaq, and Ammar's hadith was actually speaking about only the face and the palm, the face and the palms, or at least the hands, and not including all. And therefore, this is not contradictory, but this is to actually say the limit is the palm or the arm, the face, and the hands, and the extra up to the elbow is, let's call it a sunnah right there. And therefore, to go all the way up until the shoulders and so forth is actually not authentic. But it would be, just fasting, just to mention those ones, inshallah, to help us understand what is necessary and how we would do our tayammum. Now, if the person, let's say bedridden, it would be important to give them. Of course, sometimes bringing soil is probably hard, but even if a person were to use a rock, so a rock, let's say you're getting a rock, especially if we're talking about those beautiful river rocks, and just use the rock like as if you're using a soap, wipe with it and wipe your face once and wipe your hands once. That should suffice if the person is not capable of using water for the reasons that we had mentioned earlier. All right. Now, it's important to teach that to especially those that are working in the healthcare fields or even to the general Muslims that, hey, this is what you can use. So even if a person's illness were to be prolonged and so forth. And we did talk about the part about journey, if the person is on a journey, and certainly um, uh, the, the part about when we're talking about going on a journey, of course, and what relates to it in terms of tayammum and not having water. Now, the second part, what else can we actually do tayammum for? I wanted to mention here, even if we did mention the hadith of Abu Juhaym, let's look at this hadith. Where was it? So, hadith of Abu Juhaym ibn al-Harith ibn Summa. He came to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ was near Bi'r Jamal. A man came to him and he said, Assalamu alaikum, basically. And the Prophet ﷺ didn't respond to the salam until the Prophet ﷺ had come to a wall. What did he come across? He came to a wall and then he wiped his face and he wiped his hands and then he responded to salam. Now, you could say that the wall, of course, and certainly is not soil, therefore using rocks could actually suffice. Would sheetrock suffice as well? Yes, it would suffice. Why? Because sheetrock itself is actually containing some substance of cement. So cement is actually made as well of different substances from earth. So it would be considered as well. Can I use it on the dust that is probably on my bed, etc.? No, dust is not included because that dust would not be considered as the soil that we would have, or even the different rocks or even sand. Let's see the other thing. So, أو جاء أحد منكم من الغائط أو لامستم النساء. Now, the word لامستم النساء, scholars actually had differences of opinions on what does the word لامستم actually mean. Well, the word, oh, we skipped جاء أحد منكم من الغائط. Let's actually get to that one first. So, الغائط. In Islam, the Prophet ﷺ, learning from the method of the Quran, never goes graphic in his words. For example, even when the Prophet ﷺ had actually said, إِذَا جَلَسَ بَيْنَ شُعَبِهَا الْأَرْبَعَ, the Prophet ﷺ, even in the hadith, although it may seem graphic, but he would say, if the man would sit between the woman's four areas or four glands, and scholars had differences of opinions on whether that is actually talking about the legs or whether this is talking about private parts or whatever it is. And at the end of the day, it's basically speaking about the start of how and when the man is approaching his wife. The Prophet ﷺ then says that's when ghusl is basically obligatory. Now, never does the Quran go in graphic wordings. Never does it go in graphic wordings, even when it relates to speaking about wudu, in where he did not actually use graphic words, but actually said, or if any of you would come from il-gha'at is not feces. Il-gha'at is not at all urine. Il-gha'at was basically describing the area. What were they doing in that area? The area was basically a low area where every single place, of course, every single community and village, they had public areas where they would use, let's say it's a low area where it would be more modest, and it would be the area where they would use the restrooms in. Whenever it's the call of nature, they would find that area and therefore basically keep it in a specific designated area. And certainly that would be away from the people's eyes and the people's certainly smells, and then they would bury their call of nature and whatever they had done. Now, later on, that even though it was describing an area, but later on, it became familiar to people to speak about excrement and feces and actually call it gha'at, but it was not actually really the word to describe at all excrement and feces. So when you look at this piece of it, this is in order for us to learn. The Prophet ﷺ said, ليس المؤمن بالطعان ولا اللعان ولا الفاحش ولا البذيء. The Prophet ﷺ said, a believer is not ta'an, is not a person that is ta'an, which is a person that is constantly speaking about people or constantly speaking about people's bad behaviors or describing people and where they're always bashing them. وَلَلَّعَانِ. It is not a person that's constantly damning things or even complaining about everything. وَلَلْفَاحِشِ. And not a person that engages in graphic or at least explicit language that explains details of private things, وَلَا الْبَذِيء, or a person that uses profanity as the language. A Muslim is not any of these, and a mu'min does not engage in any of that. And that's why it's extremely important to adopt such a khuluq, because a person that engages in any of these ill-mannered speech, in any of these ill-mannered wordings, wallahi al-azim, it will affect their behavior. It will affect their surroundings. It is not befit for a believing man or a woman to say and use such words at any time, whether they got angry or whether they got, who knows, provoked by something. Never is it appropriate to use such kind of words at all. Now, we learn that even in the hadith and even in the Quran. So right there, you could say that, let's see the words right there. This is al-Qurtubi, and he said, al-gha'at asluhu man khafada min al-ard. That the word al-gha'at is basically the low area. And then that's why it was called Ghutat Dimashq. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ya Rabbi, give support also for the Syrians. Ya Allah, we're expanding each and every single time another Muslim area that's going through more and more sad and very sad situations. We thought that Syria was going through the worst, and now we see Gaza. And we thought later that the Muslims in Myanmar, and then now we're seeing Gaza right before everyone's eyes, as again and again. Ya Rabbi, every time I think of Gaza, my heart just stops. My heart just stops. I can't believe that the whole world has, had right now collaborated, and the Muslim Ummah is right now so silent, and all we could stand is just, all we could do is just right now even ask the West, please give us rahmah. Are you serious? Ya Allah, have we gone this week anywhere we're asking right now the West? And it's so sad. Sorry, it's so sad how we even have certain Muslim groups without naming a country. So I'm in this place in Malaysia, and we have, it's three towers, and we're talking about a huge towers. Each tower is 47 floors almost, and 37 floors. And 90% of those that are living in these towers are Arab. Okay. 90% of them are Arab. But it's so sad. I don't want to name the country, but it's so sad. Believe it or not, but we have a public masjid. And when one of the times, the some of, Gaza was going through a lot, but in one of the times there, I guess it was, I believe it was when they had stormed and bombed the hospitals and all of that, and the imam was making dua for the place of Gaza and of course, for Gaza. A group of Arab from one particular country, I don't want to name, they stopped praying in that masjid and actually formed their own masjid in a different area because of the imam that was actually praying for Gaza. Why? Because they were afraid and they were told that because they're part of that country, that the government will not give them aid or at least whatever scholarships if they are to join in any religious gatherings or even anything that is against what their country is actually right now calling for. This is the worst act of cowardice I had ever seen, to be honest. If this is something that is making them afraid to actually get the scholarship, and you're afraid to even make the dua and say Ameen for the people of Gaza, what a shame. What a shame. I'm sorry. Those are not at all the descendants of Sahaba. Those are descendants of Abu Lahab. Now you know the country I'm talking about. There's no way that these are descendants of Sahaba. These are descendants of Ubay and Abu Lahab. If your heart does not ache at what is happening in Gaza to actually make the dua and are afraid to even say Ameen, this is, even left the masjid, didn't even want to say Ameen for Gaza. Wallahi, 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 they will not find barakah, not in whatever scholarship that they had actually received, and not in their health, and not in their life. Wallahi, if such a cowardice level had actually gotten into us to not even say Ameen, I'm sorry, but this is not a descendant of a Sahabi, because the Sahaba were known for being the most courageous, were known for those that were the most manly. But this is the most cowardice act. The most cowardice act. Allahumma musta'an. I'm so sorry, everybody. But to actually see it right before your eyes, when even the Yahud, when even some Jews had actually stood up and said, when you would see John Stewart actually stand up and actually, even him as a Jew, and you would see Jews and you would see Christians actually standing up to support Gaza, but you would see a Muslim afraid. People that would actually do such a thing. Allahumma musta'an. I'm so sorry, everybody. I am just so angry. I'm just so angry. Allahumma musta'an. But I guess that's why I actually wrote that post, that praying for the ummah, Praying for Gaza is an honor that is only granted for those that are honorable, that is only granted for those that have a izzah and honor, because the honor is lillah wa li rasulihi wa lil mu'mineen. Al-izzah and honor is only for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His Prophet, and the mu'mineen. But if you were not amongst those that were given the honor to pray for Gaza, you are certainly amongst those that will be humiliated. Allah al-Musta'an. Allah al-Musta'an. All right, let's continue, because I'm right now. It just, Allah, la ilaha illallah. All right, so scholars actually had differences of opinions on whether, if a person were to do number 2 and number 1, and of course they didn't have water, on whether they didn't have water, and of course what we mean by number 1, yes, it's an idiom, but what we mean by number 1 is basically urine, and number 2 is basically excrement, or at least defecation. And where, of course, scholars had differences of opinions on whether this would actually include and be included, that if the person didn't have water, whether they can use Taymmum as an alternative if they didn't actually, if they didn't have access to water. And in general, of course, it should be, and it is, based on this ayah. So whether the person was in a state of janaba, or whether the person was ill, or whether the person was on a journey, or whether the person is actually coming from the call of nature of number 1 and number 2, or whether the person, Nisa, isn't that supposed to be in a situation of junuban? We're going to get to it. And you don't find water, you don't have access to water, that's when you're going to make tayammum as an alternative. So now the other thing is that some scholars actually limited the reason and the alternative of using tayammum when there's no access to water, or using access to water harms you, in as an alternative for, is this exclusively for these situations, illness, the situations that we had mentioned earlier, or is it including and inclusive to any situation that basically is considered as a major or a minor impurity? So right there, let's see. So here, al-Qurtubi said people had differences in how basically specific and how much, what is basically included within this. And when he says اختلف الناس, certainly he is not talking about the public people. He's not talking about random people. And he said, and that's why he's basically here talking about the different scholars. وأنبل ما قيل في ذلك أنها ثلاثة أنواع. He said the most Anbal actually means the best of the opinions, let's say it that way. The 3 different kinds. Number 1, if the person loses their mental state, in other words, their mind, and something that is basically discharging the body, and or touching. So those are the 3 different things. Now, here's one thing. For Madhab Abu Hanifa, he basically said anything that is discharged as an impurity from the body and is basically outside and goes beyond the limited area of their exit. And of course, for Abu Hanifa, he doesn't regard that touching, man, woman touching, he doesn't regard that as whatsoever basically breaking the purity, because he regarded the word lamastum to actually mean an exaggeration of touching. Exaggeration of touching, what does that mean? So exaggeration of touching, he regarded it to actually mean intimacy, not an actual touching. Let me explain this one. So There are three differences of opinions in regard to the word لامستم النساء. The word لامس actually means the actual touch. So even if you are to just barely touch, and for Madhab Shafi'i, they said that al is an inclusive al. So if a man were to touch his daughter or were to touch his mother or were to touch his wife, that would actually mean she's a woman. And if she's a woman and a man touches her, then he has to redo his wudu. That's the first opinion. And then the Shafi'is went into differences of opinions on whether it's a mahram or a non-mahram, and whether it's a wife or not, of course, and or a public woman or whatever it is. Now, this is not to mean that it is permissible to shake hands with a woman. This is just talking about wudu here. Okay, number two. The second opinion is the madhab Hanafi. They basically said the word lamastum is different than lamastum. Lamastum would actually mean you've got an a here. The word lamasa would mean to touch, but the word lamasa, they said, is an exaggeration of touching, and therefore this they considered is an idiom to mean intimacy only. Therefore, for Madhab Hanafi, touching a woman, whether that was touching and having lust or without lust, they regarded that that does not invalidate your wudu or even your purity at all. Why? They said because the word lamastum is to basically mean it is a metaphor in where it's talking about intimacy. Madhab Hanbali and Maliki, they actually had a different opinion. They said, well, the word lamastum, we're not going to just leave it to mean just touching, but the word lamastum would simply mean an exaggeration of touching as a metaphor to mean not necessarily intimacy, but to mean foreplay and lust. They said if lust is involved and along the lust or due to lust, a person gets the prostatic fluid and basically gets a discharge. And in that situation, they regarded that discharge, which is called madhi, in that discharge would basically obligate that the person would make wudu, which includes washing the private parts. Now, for the madhab, Shafi'i, for the madhab Hanbali and Maliki, in other words, they regarded that this is referring to the discharge as a result of lust, and therefore, if the water is not available to do the wudu and redo wudu as a result of such lustful discharge, then in that situation, this were to be included in using Taymmum as an alternative for not having water, and as a result of all of these areas. So now this is just summarizing how lamastum, the word lamasa, just because of this air right there, this little tiny air right there, actually had differences of opinions, just an air. And you could say, well, the question is there any hadith that gives us more details to consider one opinion stronger than the other? Yes, the Prophet ﷺ, in a hadith that is authentic, where the Prophet ﷺ, before he would go for salah, he would kiss his wives before even heading to salah. In other words, he would make wudu, kiss his wives before going to salah, and then and then not redo the wudu. This hadith is authentic. In other words, this actually makes the madhab Hanafi in this particular fatwa being the preponderant and certainly not the Shafi'i. Now, remember, we don't necessarily regard one madhab as this is our madhab that we would follow in everything. If we've got the hadith that is authentic, we take it from there and we move on. All right, so does that actually include other reasons? So here he goes. وَإِذَا تَقَرَّرَ هَذَا. In other words, if this idea was established, which is that anything that basically nullifies the wudu or any reason that breaks the wudu, he said, فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّ الْمُسْلِمِينَ أَجْمَعُوا عَلَى أَنَّ مَنْ زَالَ عَقْلُهُ بِإِغْمَاءٍ أَوْ جُنُونٍ أَوْ سُكْرٍ فَعَلَيْهِ الْوُضُوء. He said that no, that all the Muslims had unanimously agreed that if a person loses their basically mind, in other words, becomes mentally disabled in any way, whether we're talking about goes into a coma or my laptop is about to die. Hold on. My laptop is about to die. Yeah, laptops not even in Malaysia. We have the same kind of electrical system that you guys have in America. All right, let's continue. He said, وَإِذَا تقرر هذا, okay, where were we? فاعلم أن المسلمين أجمعوا على أن من زال عقله بإغماء. So whoever would basically lose their mind, whether it was a coma or whether the person lost their mind because they basically had somehow become insane, or whether it was due to intoxication. In that situation, they have to redo their wudu. Then they had differences of opinions on sleep. Why sleep? Because is the sleep itself basically what stage of sleep? How far along within our sleep? Remember, sleep is in almost 7 stages of sleep. All right. So does that actually become a hadath, or is it that it's probably that a person does or did something while they're asleep and they didn't know about it, in where they considered that, yes, even if you were to sleep, that actually means that you had lost your wudu, chances are, and you didn't know about it. Therefore, you would have to redo your wudu. Let's see, here's a question. What about if you're indoor? How do you make tayammum? What about the impurity soil that dogs? So the dog itself and walking around it, it's still making the soil itself as pure. In fact, we did actually talk about, I think, I don't know if it's this class or another class, but so even if we're talking about, you know, the different soil that dogs walk on, or even probably wild animals, the soil is still tahir. The soil is still pure. It doesn't matter unless you're actually seeing the, you know, droppings right in front of you. Remove the dropping, but the soil itself is still clean, even if the dogs were actually stepping on it. So I hope I answered that one. All right, let's move on, inshallah. Now, I hope, you know, I'm trying to not make it too long and trying to make it short. فَلَمْ تَجِدُوا مَاءً فَامْسَحُوا بِوُجُوهِكُمْ وَأَيْدِيكُمْ. And that actually helps us. فَامْسَحُوا بِوُجُوهِكُمْ, and wipe with your faces and even your hands. إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ عَفُوًّا غَفُورًا. Why عَفُوًّا? عَفُوًّا Al-afu, we talked about it before, is basically to disregard the sin that you had committed. Al-ghafur, or the one to forgive the sin is there, but he is to dismiss the implication of that sin. The implication of that sin, yes. Because without you realizing, you can actually have an implication of your sin on you, and you may not recognize why am I living like this? What's happening in my life, etc. So that's why it's important to keep that purity. Why? Because remember the purity. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was teaching the Prophet sallam, Ya ayyuhal muddathir قم فأنذر وربك فكبر وثيابك فطهر والرجز فاهجر. يا أيها المدثر, when he talked about the Prophet sallam, the one that is all bundled up in your blanket and cozy, قم فأنذر, you're on a mission. You can't live cozy. قم فأنذر, get up and warn. وربك فكبر, and you have to regard your Lord Almighty as the one that is most high, the one that is your authority, not a country, not a government, not the money, not any privilege. وَرَبَّكَ فَكَبِّرْ. Let your Lord Almighty be the place that you would regard as the highest authority. وَثِيَابَكَ فَطَهِّرْ, and purify your garments. Purify your garments. وَثِيَابَكَ فَطَهِّرْ. And when we're talking about purity, this is also involving not only the outer clothes, but this is also involving وَرُرْزَ فَهْجُرْ, and avoid any type of impurity, whether that impurity involved behavioral or whether that impurity involved any type of impurity that you yourself on your body might actually bring you into a state of impurity without you recognizing. So your body, your mouth should be pure. Your behavior and all your behavior should, of course, it's a metaphor, but should also be pure. And certainly the environment and the surroundings should also be pure. Once you live in purity, that will reflect on your heart. And what will happen? You'll be capable of actually having inner purity. This is it, and barakallahu feekum. I promised that it would only be an hour and a half because it's online of tafsir, but inshallah, well, I'm so glad that we finally finished this ayah. And Rabbi yahfadkum. And let's see this one. لامستم. He says, قرأ حمزة والكسائي لمستم. لمستم. Hamza and Kisai, they read it as لمستم, not لامستم. All right, so we actually went into all these details. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah. And yeah, you can unmute yourselves. Did I actually allow you to unmute yourself? Yeah, you. Oh, I disabled unmuting yourself. Yeah, you can unmute yourselves if you would like.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Layla, go ahead, my dear.
So my question about, like, if you're just indoors, how do you make Taymmum? You don't have access to soil.
Oh yeah. So if you're indoor and you basically have a plant in your house, you could use the soil there. You don't have to go outside and all of that. You can get a plant. You could use rocks. If you would have rocks, that would also be a good alternative. And if, of course, the wall, if it's cement, you could also use that as well.
Okay, jazakallah khair.
وإياكم. So this is it, inshallah. We will see you all Friday. I am hoping to make tafsir be daily, at least during Ramadan. But I know it's going to be during the time of iftar and tarawih. So I will figure out the best time for us, maybe perhaps something fajr for you. We'll see, inshallah. We'll see. Allah يحفظك يا رب. Allah يرضى عنك يا رب. Allah يحفظك. Yeah, we want it to be like, I don't know. We'll see the best time, inshallah. I'll let you all vote, inshallah. All right, so, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.